Hello? Can people hear me? Hello? Howdy. Can people hear me? Sorry for the late start. I'm just checking audio here. I'm not getting any audio feedback on my. Oh, there we go. Can people hear me? I'm just gonna look at my phones. I think people can hear me. Yeah, it looks like that's happening. Okay, I'll mute my phone. Okay. Um, Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Russ Weninger. I'm a lawyer with the Weninger Jong office. I practice largely in Canadian immigration law. And today I'm going to be talking about some updates in Canadian immigration law in relation to COVID-19. One thing I should mention, so I've been doing this weekly webinar series, and I've been doing it Wednesday mornings at 10 o'clock Alberta time. And I think the viewership might not be there at the moment for these live streams. So, the last few webinars I've done, I think people are suffering from information overload, and only a handful of people are tuning in, and maybe some of those people are my own relatives. So I think I might put a bit of a halt to the live webinars going forward. Just a little bit of a pause. If there's more interest in that in the future, I might bring that back. I'm going to continue to do YouTube updates, but they just won't be live updates. So I'll continue to post information to the Weninger Jong Office YouTube channel. If there's new information available in the area of immigration law that might be helpful to people, but I'm not going to, for the moment anyways, I'm not going to bother to do it as a live stream on a weekly basis. If there's a lot of demand, I might bring the live stream back, but I think I'm going to put a halt to it for the time being, just because there isn't really the viewership. So I wanted people to know that this is going to be the last live stream webinar for maybe the next little while. So yeah, that's something I just wanted to mention. I'll mention that at the end for people who tune in a little bit later. Now, so this week I wanted to go over some updates, give maybe some viewers a sense of what I'm personally experiencing in my immigration practice with client applications, things like that. I get a lot of calls from people overseas who seem to have this view that it's business as usual for Canadian immigration, that they can maybe escape the COVID-19 pandemic by immigrating to Canada or something like that they can escape it in their home countries maybe. And unfortunately, that's just not the case. The borders are essentially closed. So practically speaking, if you're outside of Canada, it's very, very difficult to come to Canada for any purpose, whether it's work, studying, family reunification, and that's not even, considering things like tourism and stuff. That's just completely off the table. But yeah, for things like work and study and family reunification, it's extremely difficult to get into Canada right now. So uh, so I wanted to talk a little bit about that today, and when you might have a realistic chance of entering Canada, and when you should just kind of give up for the time being, anyways. Um, Now, but before I get into that, though, I want to start off by thanking some people who are helping me with this webinar series and with my YouTube videos. First of all, I want to give a shout out to my student at law, my articling student, Sunny Liu, who has been doing a lot of work with my clients lately, and giving me the opportunity to explore other things, such as, producing social media content and stuff like that. And so I do really appreciate the support that I'm getting from you, Sunny, and so thank you very much for that. Sunny is going to be a full-fledged lawyer in approximately 6 months. Sunny actually had the option. For those of you who don't know, for a person to become a lawyer, what they first of all have to do is, usually what they do, not always, but in the vast majority of cases, people who become lawyers in Canada, they start off with a 4-year undergraduate degree in anything. It could be general science, it could be fine arts, it could be agriculture, it could be kinesiology, it could be anything under the sun. You get a 4-year degree usually, and then you go and you do a 3-year degree at law school, a law degree, a Bachelor of Laws, or an LLB, that's the old-timey description of the degree. Now the basic law degree in Canada is called a Doctorate of Jurisprudence. Lawyers aren't really allowed to call themselves doctors, but a lot of lawyers have this degree now, which is a Doctorate of Jurisprudence, a JD degree. I don't actually. I just have the old-fashioned LLB. But Sunny, she's got a JD, a Doctorate of Jurisprudence, a 3-year degree. So the lawyer they'll do an undergraduate degree, typically 4 years. Then they'll do the law degree, a JD, or in my case, an LLB, and then they'll article for a year. And this has been a requirement for Canadian lawyers for, time immemorial, I guess, as long as there have been Canadian lawyers, I think. Maybe back in the 19th century, it was more based on clerkship and on-the-job training and whatnot, rather than going to law school. But in recent, in the last, several generations, probably, there's been this model of doing a degree, then going to law school, and then articling for a year. And so Sunny, like every other aspiring lawyer, has been following that path. The Law Society actually gave articling students the option of just doing 8 months this year rather than the full 12 months. And the reason for that was because of the pandemic. They wanted to ease the strain on students and law firms who were going through the pandemic, and wanted to make it easier for lawyers to complete their articles, or for aspiring lawyers to complete their articles. And Sunny actually opted, even though this was an option that was available to her, to complete her articles sooner, maybe in as little as 2 months from now. She opted to do a full 12 months, the normal articling term, because she wanted to get that extra experience and become as well trained as absolutely possible. So I really appreciate that about Sunny. She's a really hard worker and diligent and committed to her clients and the practice of law. And so I expect nothing but the best from Sunny going forward. I think she's going to make an outstanding lawyer in the future. And I'd also, aside from Sunny, I'd also like to thank my family, my common law partner Hiroko Nakao, and my daughter Natalie, for putting up with me during this pandemic, and for allowing me to do these videos, and for going into other rooms in the house and staying quiet while I'm doing these live stream webinars. So yeah, I couldn't do it without you. We're all working from home at the moment, but Hiroko and Natalie have been accommodating me while I've been doing these live stream webinars, and I very much appreciate that. A little bit of housekeeping before we really get into things. I should mention I'm going to just be talking about immigration law today. If you have any questions at any point, feel free to enter them into the chat dialog box, and I'll be happy to respond to those questions. But just make sure it's immigration related, not dealing with some other area of law, and try not to get too specific or too personal. I don't want to be basically giving specific legal advice over YouTube. So you know, questions of a more general nature, I'm happy to answer those sorts of questions, but I don't want this to turn into a private consultation for someone who happens to be watching the live stream. So because that's not fair to them if their circumstances are archived on YouTube for everyone to see. So please try to keep it general if you're asking questions, and don't provide me with any very specific identifying information that others might be able to use to figure out who you are. Hopefully that makes sense. But with those caveats aside, I'm happy to take questions throughout today's session. I'm going to be trying to end it right at 11 a.m. sharp, because I've got another my days are occupied with Zoom meetings these days, and so I do have a Zoom appointment today at 11:30, and I need to prepare for that, so I'll be cutting it off right at 11 today. I won't be going over, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask away at any point. Now, a little bit about myself. Every week I'm trying to, let people know something about me that they might not know. One thing that might not be common knowledge is that my dad's side of the family, they're originally from Saskatchewan, and so my dad grew up in a small town in Allen, Saskatchewan, which is just outside of Saskatoon, about 30 minutes from Saskatoon. Small little community. Farming community. My dad grew up on a farm there back in the 1930s, and his first language was actually German. So back in those days, a lot of farming communities, in particular, they were settled by immigrants from different European countries. So some farming communities would be largely Ukrainian. Other farming communities would have largely German-speaking people. Some communities might have a lot of French-speaking people. But it was very common in the prairies in particular. So in places like Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, to have a lot of people from places like parts of Russia as well, but Ukraine and Germany, and so people would come speaking those languages, and they would settle in these farming communities, and oftentimes kids wouldn't learn how to speak English until they went off to school. So um, uh, and in fact, my grandmother, my dad's mom, immigrated to Canada from well, she what was the Ukraine. It was the Soviet Union, but it was in the Ukraine, but she came from a German speaking community in the Ukraine, and then she moved to Saskatchewan, immigrated to Canada and moved to Saskatchewan, and so that's where my paternal grandmother came from, and my paternal grandfather actually was an immigrant as well. He immigrated from the U.S. He was from a bunch of or he was from a community of German-speaking farmers as well, but rather than coming from Europe, he actually immigrated to Canada from the U.S. at a very early age. At the age of, I think the family moved up to Saskatchewan when he was maybe 3 years old or something like that. So yeah, my grandfather was quite young. So that's on my dad's side. So my dad came from a small farming community in Saskatchewan. On my mom's side, my maternal grandfather, he actually immigrated from Hungary back in, I think it would have been maybe the late 1920s, early 1930s, maybe, that he immigrated to Canada from Hungary. So so even though I'm not an immigrant myself, my family members, at my grandparents' stage, most of them were immigrants to Canada. So I'm not one of those people who can say my family's been here, for 300 years or something like that, or like Indigenous Canadians, First Nations Canadians, who can say they've been here for time immemorial, for tens of thousands of years, maybe. Yeah, my family, they're relative newcomers to Canada. And my partner, she's from Japan. She grew up in Japan and immigrated to Canada. So yeah, many Canadians are either immigrants or they have very close ties to immigrants, and that includes me. So I just wanted to mention that briefly, because sometimes I know immigrants, when they come to Canada, they feel like they don't fit in. They feel like they're newcomers, that they're that they don't belong for some reason. That's not the case. I understand why people feel that way, but and maybe sometimes people are made to feel that way by other Canadians, but you definitely do belong. If you're an immigrant, if you're a first generation person coming to Canada, you should be proud of yourself. Canada was largely, modern Canada was largely built on immigration, and you do fit in and you do belong here. And the vast majority of Canadians currently, and there are some good things and bad things about that too. There are unfortunate historical consequences of colonialism, and especially like Europeans coming to Canada. But historically, the bulk of the Canadian population that's currently here historically can trace its roots to immigration, and immigration is a huge driver of the Canadian economy. It's one of the reasons Canada has done so well relative to many other countries economically, um, is that we have this influx of immigrants, and immigrants, when they come to Canada, they create jobs, they create economic demand, they stimulate the economy in different ways, and they bring money here from overseas. And so immigration is vital to Canadian society. We would not be the country we are without immigration, and that's historical immigration and that's current immigration. We actually absolutely depend on immigration. So yeah, I just wanted to share my thoughts on that with you guys today. Now, in terms of updates, I wanted to go over a few things today. I wanted to kind of give my perspective on how the government is operating in terms of immigration, what you can expect in terms of processing times, things like that, and talk about what people's prospects are in terms of entering Canada. Now, currently, most borders are closed, so it's very, very difficult for people to move between countries. If you're currently in Canada, it's difficult to leave Canada and go somewhere else. If you're wanting to come to Canada, it's very, very, very difficult. Now, in some cases, it's possible. So if, for example, you're an immediate family member, the Trudeau government yesterday actually announced that they were going to try to make it easier for family reunification. Recently, there have been a lot of stories in the media about how people have been having a difficult time reuniting with people like spouses, for example. So in particular, there was a lot of media coverage about American spouses who were separated from their Canadian spouses because of the border closure. And so the government announced that they would try to make it easier for people to unify with or be reunited with their families. So I was reading this CBC article earlier today, prior to this webinar, and it was talking about how those changes were to take effect at midnight. So I guess that would have been 12 a.m. this morning, and so the changes are meant to apply at the Canada-US border. So people coming from the US into Canada, if they're a spouse or common law partner of a Canadian citizen or a dependent child, and dependent childs for immigration purposes are, in most cases, children under the age of 22. There are some exceptions to that, so a disabled older child might still be considered a dependent child. But for most immigration purposes, the cutoff for being a dependent child is the age of 22. So once you hit your 22nd birthday, you're no longer considered to be a dependent child. Now, whether they're applying that cutoff to this or they're applying the age of 18 as the cutoff, which is the age of adulthood in Canada, or at least in most provinces in Canada, I'm not sure about that. But it says dependent children are considered family members who can be reunited. Parents or step-parents, or the parent or step-parent of the person's spouse or common law partner. So mothers-in-law, fathers-in-law, step-parents, and parents, they can potentially be reunited with family members in Canada. Also, guardians or tutors. So where that would apply would be sometimes people have nannies and caregivers and people like that. Uh, and so those people can potentially be reunited with Canadian families as well. Now, um, reading this news story about this policy, I'm wondering how it's different from the earlier government policy for family reunification. So all these people who are listed as, family members who can reunite with their Canadian families or family members, all these people, spouses, parents, step parents, dependent children, etc. They were already supposedly able to come to Canada to be reunited with their family members. But practically speaking, what was happening was Canada Border Services was putting all these restrictions and saying, well, you have to show that you're coming for an essential purpose. And they created all these internal scenarios. So they kind of created this internal guide that they didn't really share publicly with the general public, but they internally, the department had this memo that went through some scenarios as to when a family member was coming here for an essential purpose, and those people could potentially be allowed to enter Canada, but other family members, even if they were a spouse or a common law partner or parent or dependent child or whatever, they wouldn't necessarily be admissible to Canada during the travel ban, even if they met the definition of family member. It had to be for an essential purpose. So with this announcement of the governments that they're going to make it easier for these people to reunite with Canadian families, it's not really clear what's different. Are they going to relax the interpretation of essential? Because apparently you still have to meet the requirements of coming to Canada for an essential purpose. And apparently this new policy only applies to travel across the Canada-US border. So whether that just applies to land border crossings or it applies to flights into Canada, and whether it applies to flights into Canada from other countries rather than just the US, it's not immediately clear from the news articles. And so this is a case in point, actually, of something that happens quite often in reporting on Canadian immigration, is that the details and media articles, when the media is talking about Canadian immigration, oftentimes certain important details are glossed over. And so Canadians sometimes and people who aren't Canadians, people who are looking at coming to Canada or immigrating to Canada, they'll read a news article or they'll see a video of some announcement, and in that article or in that video, important details are glossed over. And what anyone should do if they're considering doing an immigration application or traveling to Canada, any media article they should take with a grain of salt. So any announcement, any government policy announcement, any article written by a Canadian media organization about immigration, they oftentimes provide very helpful information, and information that's helpful to immigration lawyers as well, because sometimes immigration's lawyers tend to be tied into all these different channels. For example, I'm a member of the Canadian Bar Association, and so through that membership, I oftentimes get and receive announcements on all sorts of policy changes and updates and things like that, legislative changes, those sorts of things. But another source of information for me is the media as well. But I've learned over the years to take media articles in particular with a grain of salt, because journalists aren't immigration lawyers, and for that matter, politicians aren't immigration lawyers. So Justin Trudeau or the immigration minister, for that matter, they may, stand up in front of a podium and make an announcement about how they're going to make it easier for families to reunite with each other. But the devil's in the details, and that's where immigration lawyers come in. And so oftentimes you have to take these policy announcements with a grain of salt. So I think it remains to be seen whether or not it's going to be easier for family members to actually enter Canada. Initially, I'm somewhat skeptical, but we'll see. Maybe it's going to be easier for spouses and common law partners and people like that to actually come to Canada right now. So if that's the case, then that's good news. I'm not sure that's the case though. So that remains to be seen. But supposedly, as of midnight last night, there are changes at least at the Canada-US border. So if that applies to you, hopefully that's good news. Veronica wrote a question. Hi, Russ. Thank you for your streams. I want to ask what kind of proof I have to submit when I want to remove a dependent from my PR application. I got an email for what exactly to submit. Will a letter explaining my situation be enough? Future divorce. Okay. Okay. Good question. Now, when a person has a dependent, they ordinarily they either have to include them on the application, or they always have to include them on the application. So either they have to mention the person on the application, whether or not the person's coming to Canada. So if you have a dependent child, or a dependent spouse for that matter, even, and sometimes people who are still in perfectly good relationships, maybe one spouse will immigrate to Canada and the other won't. Sometimes people have a long distance relationship, and they visit each other fairly frequently, but they live in different cities and in some cases different countries, and one spouse will apply for permanent residence and the other won't. So that's possible, and the same with dependent children, especially older dependent children. So sometimes kids in their late teens, and earlier I was talking about the age of dependency being 22. So sometimes even a 21-year-old child could potentially be included on an immigration application, but that child, for whatever reason, doesn't want to immigrate to Canada. Or the other parent of that child doesn't want the child to immigrate to Canada. It's very common in scenarios where a couple has broken up, for example, and one spouse or former spouse then moves to Canada. If they come to Canada and they're trying to immigrate, and they have a former spouse back home, and they've got a dependent child living with that former spouse back in their home country. In some cases, the spouse in the other country will not want the dependent child to immigrate to Canada, and that's fine. There's as I mentioned earlier, there's no reason why a dependent has to immigrate with the person who is trying to immigrate to Canada. But if the person is a dependent, immigration, so IRCC, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, they expect that the dependent child or the dependent spouse even, that they will be medically examined, whether or not they're coming to Canada. And if they aren't medically examined, that creates a problem, because once the principal applicant, once the person who's applying for permanent residence, once they actually get permanent residence, then in theory they can sponsor this spouse that didn't initially come to Canada, or this child who didn't initially come to Canada, and so the government created regulations about this, and I believe the regulation is 117.9D. Hopefully I got that right. If I got that wrong, that's embarrassing, because that's a very common regulation that negatively impacts a lot of applicants. And so what regulation 179D of the Immigration Refugee Protection Regulations, what that says is that if you haven't been examined when your family member became a permanent resident, and at that time you were a family member of that person, for immigration purposes, you're not considered a family member, so you can't be sponsored at a later date. So, for example, if someone immigrates to Canada, and at the time of immigration they have a spouse or common law partner or a dependent child, and then that family member, that spouse or common law partner or dependent child, that person isn't examined, later on that spouse or common law partner or dependent child can't actually be sponsored for permanent residence. And then the only option, basically, at a future date, if they want to bring that person to Canada, there are a couple options, actually. One is that person might independently qualify for permanent residence. So maybe that spouse or dependent child or whatever, maybe they qualify under express entry at a later time, or under a provincial nominee program at a later time. So that's one option. Another option is a humanitarian and compassionate grounds application. So sometimes people who can't sponsor their spouse or common law partner or dependent child for whatever reason, in some cases, use can be made of a humanitarian and compassionate grounds application. But the general rule is that if the spouse or partner or dependent child is non-accompanying, they have to be medically examined, or they can't be sponsored in the future. To make matters worse, if a spouse or common law partner or dependent child isn't medically examined, IRCC will make it very difficult for the immigration application to be processed to completion. So you usually have to satisfy, you have to typically do one of two things, and maybe both of these things. You have to satisfy IRCC, and I know this is a long-winded answer to your question, Veronica, but you have to satisfy IRCC that you've made best efforts to try to get that person to medically examine themselves. So you know, in the case of a dependent child, for example, they IRCC would typically want evidence that you've reached out to the other parent, to maybe your ex-spouse, who's the other parent of this child, that you've reached out to that person and made several requests to have the child examined. If the child is over 18, maybe you've made several requests to the child, who's maybe as old as 21, to get them to medically examine. And so they want to make sure that you've put in the effort to try to get that child examined. Um, or that dependent examined, I should say, because it might be a spouse, for example. Although if you have a spouse, you would expect cooperation in that regard. If you're still in a good relationship, you would expect that the non-accompanying spouse, even though they don't plan to immigrate, that they would cooperate with your efforts to immigrate to Canada, and they go through the examination voluntarily. But where you find the resistance and the refusal to examine is typically with dependent children, when either the child themselves, if they're over the age of 18 but under the age of 22, they refuse to be examined, or the other parent refuses to have the child examined. So that's where you get these problems. And if you can show that you've made consistent best efforts to try to convince the other parent or to convince the child to medically examine, sometimes that's helpful. In some cases, IRCC will even expect people to make use of the courts. So in the other jurisdictions. So for example, let's say you used to live in the US and you were divorced from a former spouse, and you had a minor child living in the US with that former spouse. In some cases, IRCC would expect that people would actually get a court order from a U.S. court to force the other parent to have the child medically examined. Alternatively, IRCC will accept things like a legal document that shows that the other parent has sole custody of the child. So they have sole decision-making authority of the child, and they can refuse to have the child examined. Because IRCC, they operate under the assumption that for parents or for people who are trying to immigrate to Canada, if one of those people happens to be a parent of an overseas child, that person has essentially the same rights that a parent would typically be expected to have under Canadian family law. That's a dubious assumption, by the way. It's not. Many countries don't have well-developed family law legal procedures, or if they do have these legal procedures, maybe there's very little enforcement of family law in those countries. For example, I've heard that's the case with many Asian countries like Japan, China, the Philippines, those sorts of places. They might have family law procedures in place, but to enforce those procedures, or to enforce the family law rules is very difficult. So practically speaking, family law remedies to force a child to be medically examined in another country, those may not exist. But nonetheless, immigration policy in Canada is that there's this expectation that if there are those legal remedies, that the person wishing to immigrate to Canada, they'll explore those legal remedies. Now, so if the person can't get medically examined, if they refuse to, or if the other parent refuses to, the other thing that IRCC typically expects is that the principal applicant, the parent who's immigrating to Canada, that they'll sign a declaration, a sworn declaration that says that they will not in the future sponsor that, or that they acknowledge that they're giving up the right to sponsor that dependent in the future, whether that's a child or a non-accompanying spouse or common law partner. So that's IRCC's expectation. Now, so Veronica just sent me another message. She said that I guess medicals were done, and that's, so maybe it's more an issue of the families just the overseas family members are just refusing to come at this point. If medicals are done, that's fine. Then you just notify IRCC and advise them that there's current separation with the other family member and that you're taking them off the application. And but if the medicals have already been done, then that's basically all they need at that point, assuming the other information has been provided, like maybe typically initially when someone applies for permanent residence, they'll already provide the passport and that sort of information of the other family members. So assuming IRCC has all the information they need about the non-accompanying child, and the non-accompanying child has already been medically examined, that's probably all you have to do is contact IRCC and advise them that rather than them being accompanying family members, now they're going to be non-accompanying family members. So I hope that answers your question, Veronica. By the way, to do that, to notify IRCC, the best way to do that in most cases is to use the web form. So there's a web form on the IRCC website that allows a person, after they've submitted an immigration application, to provide further information about the application to IRCC. So if they have to provide them with another document, or if they have to advise them about a change of circumstances, or if they have to ask a question related to the application, they can do that sort of communication through the web form on the IRCC website. So that was a very good question. Thank you for asking that, Veronica. And it applies to a lot of people. And I especially right now with COVID-19, it might be very difficult for many families, very stressful for many families. And it might be tough to do things like medical examinations even right now. Now, if that's the case, if it's not so much an issue of the family member doesn't want to come, but it's just that at this point in time they can't come, the borders are closed, or maybe the medical offices that would do these medical examinations, they're closed. If that's the case, then what you can do is just contact IRCC through the web form and advise them that right now the family member can't complete the medical for whatever reason. If they're ordered to stay in the house by if they have kind of a quarantine order in place in their home country, or if the medical offices that are performing those examinations, if those are closed in that country, then they can just advise IRCC of that, and IRCC will typically give them an extension to provide that information. In fact, that's their stated policy, that in those sorts of cases, because of the pandemic, they will provide those types of extensions. So so if that applies to you out there, then yeah, be aware of that you can request an extension from IRCC for those sorts of purposes. But yeah, very good question, and it's applying to a lot of people right now during the pandemic. Yeah, I wanted to talk about a little bit more, and I talked about this a little bit last week, but I wanted to talk about the barriers to entry to Canada. Now, so in most cases, the borders are closed except for exceptional circumstances, except for circumstances of things like family reunification, stuff like that, and except in situations where workers are deemed essential, or where the purpose of entry is for some essential purpose. Um, so as a general rule, and I'm getting a lot of these inquiries right now from people overseas who want to come to Canada, and that's perfectly natural. And ordinarily, I'd be happy to take those requests and consult with those sorts of people and give them advice. Now, what I tend to be telling clients or prospective clients when they contact me and say, "I want some information about how to come to Canada," my advice to them is uh, look, it's going to be virtually impossible, regardless of your circumstances, unless you happen to be, a medical doctor who's already provisionally licensed in Canada, or something like that, or you're an agricultural worker who's been kind of pre-approved for a work permit or something like that, and you're coming to work in a farm or a meat processing plant or something like that in Canada. So unless you're one of those sorts of people, or unless you're, airline staff or something like that, and you have to fly to Canada for work as a, a pilot or something like that. So unless you're one of those essential workers, or one of those workers who's exempted from the normal travel ban, you're not going to be able to get into Canada for the foreseeable future. And things like the express entry system that would normally allow people who've never set foot in Canada to potentially qualify for permanent residence. Those options aren't available at the moment. So currently with express entry, the draws that are happening under express entry are happening under the Canadian Experience class and under the provincial nominee program. So they're not drawing people under the federal skilled worker category currently. That may change in the future, but currently they're not drawing people under the federal skilled worker category. And I don't think they're doing a lot of draws in the federal skilled trades category either. Oftentimes, even last year, maybe 2 or 3 times they drew people under the federal skilled trades category. But currently, and since the pandemic, the immigration draws for express entry have been under the Canadian Experience class and under the provincial nominee program. So what that means, practically speaking, is that if you're trying to immigrate from outside Canada and you don't have any Canadian work experience, for example, you don't have a current job offer in Canada, you don't have you haven't been nominated by a provincial government for under an express entry stream, you're not going to get through under express entry. Your points could be 900 points or something, like, say, right? Maybe not 900 points, but you could have a lot of points. But if you're only qualifying under the federal skilled worker stream, you're not going to receive an invitation to apply under express entry for some time, probably until the borders start opening up again. So that's something to be aware of. That for people who are just interested in immigrating to Canada, but they don't have that recent work experience in Canada or that immediate connection to Canada, it's just not practical for them to plan on immigrating to Canada in the next little while. So for clients who haven't yet set foot in Canada but are interested in coming to Canada, I'm typically telling them, look, check in with me maybe in a few months or 6 months or a year or something like that. But for the immediate future, your chances of doing anything, even coming to Canada temporarily as a worker or as a student, the chances are slim to none. Even people who might have very good reasons for coming to Canada, either as a student or a worker or something like that, applications are being processed at a snail's pace because most overseas visa officers are actually now in Canada working from home. So visa applications are still being processed, things like that, not visitor visa applications. If your purpose is just non-essential, if it's just something like tourism or something like that, they're typically not going to process your application. For some family reunification purposes, they might process temporary like visitor visa applications, but even there, the expectation is going to be that the person will not just be coming for a couple of weeks or something like that. They'll be coming for several months, and the goal will be to ride out the pandemic here in Canada. So practically speaking, it's very, very difficult for anyone who doesn't yet have permanent residence or is not yet a Canadian citizen. It's difficult for those people to come to Canada, and will be for the foreseeable future. Another update I'd like to provide just in passing, I mentioned earlier that people might try things like significant benefit work permit applications to come to Canada, even if they're working in a job that a significant benefit work permit wouldn't ordinarily apply to. So usually significant benefit work permits apply to special sorts of people, like high-level academics, or high-level athletes or people like that, or to business owners who are going to be creating a business and employing Canadians in Canada and investing a lot of money into the Canadian economy. But I suggested earlier that people might try to do those applications for other workers, for even unskilled workers who are working in industries that were considered essential, or even if they weren't considered essential, they were the person was wanting to continue to live in Canada and pay their rent and buy groceries and not have to go on the CERB and things like that. So I suggested that people who otherwise wouldn't normally qualify for a significant benefit work permit, that might be something to try, and to make those arguments that the basic acts of paying rent and buying groceries and things like that those are significant benefits to the Canadian economy. And so I submitted one of those applications recently, not necessarily expecting it would work, but hoping it would work, and thinking it was worth a try. And, I think less than a week later, we got a rejection. And that was just the other day, and they said, sorry, this doesn't meet their criteria for a significant benefit work permit. Now, it might be the case that it was just for that particular application or that particular immigration officer, and that other immigration officers might be more generous, and if the circumstances were a little bit different, that maybe the result would have been different. But I just wanted people to be aware of that the earlier strategy that I proposed, my initial anecdotal evidence is that strategy might not be well received by immigration officers. So I just wanted people to be aware of that. So it's 11:01, so I'm going to be turning it off in just a second here. But before I go, is there anyone out there who has a question? Doesn't look like it. I think maybe there are only a couple of people on the stream at this point. If you do have a question, maybe type it in the next 20 seconds, and I'll try to answer it. Anyways, assuming there are no further questions, once again, I'd like to give a special shout out to my thank you to my student Sunny Liu for assisting with this webinar, and for doing a lot of the heavy lifting in servicing my immigration clients. So that's very much appreciated, Sunny. And again, thank you to my family for putting up with me, allowing me to do these webinars in our home while everyone is, my partner is also working from home, and my daughter is doing her schooling from home at the moment. And so thank you for so much for putting up with me and giving me the necessary space to do this webinar. And as I noted earlier, this is going to be the last live stream webinar, maybe for the next little while. I'm going to put it on hold because I just don't have the viewership at the moment for that. I find that the archived views of these videos oftentimes get looked at a fair bit, or that the video, once it's archived, it gets viewed a fair bit. But in terms of live stream, I'm not getting the viewers to justify getting up every Wednesday and religiously doing a live stream webinar on Monday or on Wednesday morning. So this will be the last one for the next little while, but if there's interest, I'll bring it back. So let me know, put it in the comments if you want me to bring it back. Tell your friends. You know, if I get a groundswell of support for live stream webinars, I'll consider bringing them back. But and maybe I'll experiment with a live stream webinar in a couple of weeks or a month or 2 months or something like that to see if there's an interest. But for the time being, I'm going to be doing updates, but they just won't be live streamed. So I'll try to let my viewers know, the people out there somewhere on the internet. I'll try to let you know of any developing updates as they happen, but I just won't be live streaming that for the next little while. Well, doesn't look like I have any other questions, so thank you for watching. I very much appreciate people watching these webinars and these archived videos, and feel free to reach out to me with any content suggestions. So if you have something in mind for a video, or you think people are confused by a particular topic and or need more information on that topic, and you'd like me to address that, let me know, and I'd be happy to discuss that information, assuming it relates to Canadian immigration law. But anyways, thanks for watching, and bye for now, and I'll talk to you in the future. Okay, see you.